Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. This week I decided to give my corals a bit of a trim if they've started to overgrow in some areas. Corals are colonial animals and can grow anywhere from a few centimetres up to several metres in diameter. For me, I love watching how my corals grow over time and fill out the tank, and I love how each species has its own unique growth morphology. However, to ensure that the corals don't fight and kill each other, I do have to trim them occasionally. When aquascaping and trimming corals, I use a variety of different tools. I utilise 2 different sizes of coral cutters as well as some tweezers. For gluing the corals back to the rockwork, I just use a general purpose cyanoacrylate glue which can be found at most hardware stores. The first thing I generally do is go around the tank and look for any corals that might have fallen over or been snapped in half. This generally happens as corals get too big to support themselves and then will get knocked off by other fish or the wave motion from the wave makers. This large Montipora digitata is a prime example of this, as you can see it has gotten quite large but is only supported by a single base. I've actually had this particular coral for well over 6 years now, and it has been in 4 of my previous tanks. Sometimes instead of using glue to attach them back, I'll just lodge the corals back into their original colony where they came from, and over time they'll start to fuse back together. My redline cleaner shrimp loves to give me a manicure and will often follow me around the tank whenever I'm putting my hands in it. I decided I wanted a bit more green on this side of the tank, so I snapped a bit off and I'm attaching it to the rockwork on the left hand side. If you are new to keeping SPS, I highly recommend getting some Montipora digitata. They are really quite hardy and can survive in a lot of different tank environments. The next thing I do is go around the tank and take out any dead skeletons that might be left. I'll often inherit corals from tanks that are being shut down, however these corals are sometimes not in the best of health. Despite this, I'll always try my best to rehabilitate them, however some are just too far gone to do anything about. Corals are a lot like bonsai trees in the fact that you can shape and manipulate them over time. However, the shapes of corals are also impacted by environmental factors, such as water flow and light intensity. I could make my life easier by not having as many corals in the tank, but I love how full the tank looks, and I also love how it's representative of the natural environment, where often you'll have corals growing all over one another. I'm constantly trimming the Poeciloperas and Seriatoporas in this tank as they grow quite quickly. As I trim the corals, I'll place the fragments off to the side where I can re-glue them onto frag plugs later. I try and leave this particular area of the tank alone as much as possible, as I have a pair of breeding coral gobies that live there. However, I am concerned that the acropora that they live in is not getting enough light and is being shaded too much by the corals above it. My favourite fish in the tank is actually this red flamehawk, and his name is Roger, and will follow us around the room watching us. When trimming large, thick pieces of coral like this Poecilopora verrucosa, I like to snap the branches off by twisting whilst pulling down the pliers. I have to be careful with big, thick pieces of coral like this, as I run the risk of snapping the entire colony off the rockwork. The coral gobies are actually quite territorial and protective of their eggs. They'll often chase away fish and inverts which are a lot larger than them themselves. Often my coral banded shrimp will reach up and try and grab their eggs, however he will be chased away by the 2 coral gobies. Much like jellyfish and anemones, corals also have stinging cells which they use for self-defense as well as catching prey. As space on coral reefs is quite limited, corals will do whatever they can to protect themselves, and if 2 different species grow into one another, they'll often battle it out like we have here. If I cannot prevent the corals from fighting, I at least like to remove the bits of skeleton that have died as a result of this. These bits of skeleton will start to host algae, and due to the confined spaces in which they often are, my urchins and snails can't get in there to consume it. I'm also having to constantly trim this red Montipora, as it grows pretty quickly and it is extremely aggressive towards other corals. As for pests such as Aptasia, I generally don't care too much about them. However, for this particular one it was getting quite big and was also preventing me putting corals just above it, as it would have killed them. There are loads of different ways that you can remove Aptasia from an aquarium system, but personally I've just found this method to be the simplest. All my urchins and snails are actually quite large, so they often struggle to get in the confined areas to remove algae such as this. As a result, I'll often go around and try and remove this algae manually. I think in the future I'll try and get some more baby urchins, as the urchins have been doing a really good job of the areas that they can access. Now that the Aptasia is gone, I can glue this new frag in its place. When gluing new corals to existing rockwork, I'll give the surfaces a thorough clean, as the glue won't hold if there's any algae on underneath it. This Goniopora hasn't been doing too well, so I've decided to move it to a different area of the tank. Once I've finished trimming all the corals, I'll glue them onto frag plugs so that they can be used in either other builds, or I can take them to uni and they can go into the research tanks there. It is important to remember to clean all your fragging tools in fresh water after you finish with them. This will prevent them from becoming rusty and unusable. Whenever I do work on my tank, I always feed my fish immediately after. This kind of reinforces the idea that whenever I'm around the tank they think they're going to get fed. This in turn minimises the amount of stress that they experience when I've got my hands in and around the tank. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned if you want to see my next build.